Tonight, apocalyptic flooding, hundreds of tornadoes and a crippling heat wave. The world's weather has never been so extreme. From China to Kenya to Brazil, heavy rainfall has killed hundreds of people in recent weeks, with one Brazilian province effectively cut off. And scientists say the temperatures will keep on rising. Last month was the hottest ever on record. So how much of this is El Nino, or is it just about climate change? I'll ask a storm chaser who's hunting the latest tornado on America's Great Plains. Also tonight, what now for Gaza's most vulnerable? The main border is still shut and Israel is plotting another offensive. There's no way out for those who need urgent medical care. I'll hear from two doctors who say children are being left to die. As the UK punishes Russia again, we'll reveal how the Kremlin is making huge profits despite oil sanctions. And ahead of Israel's Eurovision performance, we ask fans if you can really keep politics out of pop music. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. Let's start with what we already know. We've known for several years about the impact of climate change, that the Earth and its oceans are getting warmer, and that unless we reduce harmful greenhouse gases and change our daily lives, things will only get worse. But we're now used to these images. A powerful tornado in Nebraska, one of 300 to tear through the American Midwest in the past month. Or this, the aftermath of severe flooding in Burundi and across East Africa, which has left hundreds of people dead or tens of thousands displaced. Southern Asia is baking in the extreme heat. That's, as scientists confirmed last month, was the hottest ever on record. But here's the thing, despite all of this, these pictures that suggest the end of days, some governments, including here in the UK, are rowing back on their green pledges. We'll discuss why in a moment, and hear from a tornado chaser in Arkansas. But let's begin with the worst natural disaster ever to hit southern Brazil. Our international correspondent Alex Rossi has tonight's first report.
The water just keeps on rising. As far as the eye can see, a cityscape submerged under the brown floodwater. Authorities say this is the worst climate disaster to ever hit southern Brazil, and it's easy to see why. In Porto Alegre, streets and avenues are inundated, with the city's iconic buildings surrounded. Even the airport is an expanse of water, a vital link cut off from the outside world. Everywhere you look, it is utter devastation. More than 150,000 people have been displaced. Many of them had to be rescued in makeshift boats. This area is now without fresh drinking water, electricity, and there are dwindling supplies of food.
It's been very sad to see people desolate, not knowing exactly where to go, walking with no direction, not knowing which way to go without contact because there's no power, no communication, no cell phone signal.
The Brazilian government is describing this environmental catastrophe as a warlike situation, an emergency made worse by man-made climate change and a more unpredictable weather system.
The floods in southern Brazil are linked to El Nino, but not in a proportion of we have seen. We never had this volume of water. The fact that half of the state is underwater, this is climate change.
These satellite pictures show the extent of the damage. Rows of homes in a residential street before and after the deluge started. In some places, the floods are receding, but what people are returning to is heartbreaking. These communities have been ripped apart by the powerful torrential rains. And there's no sign this suffering will end anytime soon. Forecasters are warning the flooding will spread as more heavy storms are on their way. Alex Rossi, Sky News.
Well, let's discuss this further with our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook, who is here with me now. And Victoria, I mean, we continue to see these extreme weather events, but how much of this is about climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first, let me just put this all into context. First thing to say is that, of course, we've always had extreme weather, even before humans started to change the climate, mainly by burning fossil fuels. So we've had heat waves and flooding and all sorts for a very, very long time, of course. And the second thing is to say is that weather is actually really complicated. Anyone who lives in the UK and has been surprised sometimes by weather forecasts and the reality knows that it is complicated. There's a lot going on, and actually there's a whole field of science dedicated to working out when we have extreme events, and it's growing as climate change intensifies, but they are dedicated to finding out when we have these extreme weather events, what role did climate change play? So it's complicated. Having said that, there are two key things happening at the moment that are influencing a lot of the extreme events, some of which we saw earlier. Tornadoes, they're not so sure about, actually. That one's a bit of a conundrum, not really sure about climate change there, but certainly with flooding and heat. So with climate change, today actually we learned that April was the hottest April on record. So that chart that you can see there shows just how extraordinarily hot this year has been. That's the yellow line that you see across the top. And not only that, last year was really hot as well. So April was hot, but it was the 11th consecutive month of record heat. And the heat does a couple of things. One is well, it does many things, but in terms of flooding, hotter air is thirstier, like us. So when the air is hot, it can hold more moisture. So when it rains, maybe it would have rained anyway, but it can unleash a lot more rain. And that's what scientists think may have happened in Brazil.
So as you say, I mean, weather and the weather conditions are complicated. So that's climate change. How much of this is also about the El Nino effect?
Yeah, good question. So El Nino is this naturally occurring weather phenomenon. It happens every few years. It's not exactly regular, but basically it releases a load of heat that's stored in a part of the Pacific, and that releases it elsewhere into the ocean and into the air, and it has this huge impact on weather patterns virtually all around the world. It has almost an outsized role. It's bearing in mind where it starts from one place, spreads around the world, and they think that El Nino probably did contribute to the flooding in Brazil by influencing some of the heat in the wind and some of the moisture in the air coming from elsewhere in the country. So El Nino, even without climate change, would have brought some more extreme impacts as well.
I guess the question is, are we doing enough to deal with climate change then? Because it is playing a role.
Yeah, well, today we got some new data actually from the think tank EMBER that found that we have a record amount of our electricity around the world now coming from renewables, so 30%. And that is really driven by this extraordinary growth in wind and solar that we've seen in the last two decades, far beyond really what anyone expected. Costs just plummeted. So solar, for example, costs fell by 90% in 10 years, and they halved again just last year. So that's good news for the climate in terms of the more renewable power we have, the less we need to burn fossil fuels. And actually, we think the amount of fossil fuels we burn to get our power might start to fall, which is a very sort of important psychological moment to feel like things are changing. Having said that, the world is not moving quickly enough, according to what science says we need to. We've had some rowing back on some climate targets in the UK by Rishi Sunak, by Labour, by the SNP, as really politicians start to encounter the really difficult bits of climate change. And also I think that's a reflection on it being an election issue. So there's really climate change these days, I think, has this sort of dual narrative of, on the one hand, yes, we're greening the economy, we're roughly moving in the right direction. On the other hand, not quickly enough, and that's why we're seeing these more intense extreme weather events.
And we will continue to see that. Victoria, thank you so much. Well, America's Great Plains are used to tornadoes. The last month has seen a swarm of twisters, at least 300 of them, leave a trail of destruction across states like Oklahoma and Nebraska, and more expected this week. Well, that footage was filmed by storm chaser and my radio meteorologist, Matthew Capucci, who's tracking a tornado in Oklahoma. Matthew, thanks so much for joining us. As we said, you're tracking a tornado at the moment. You're in your car to do that. Just tell us what you're doing.
Yeah, most definitely. So I work as a meteorologist, a weather forecaster, and I track these large-scale weather systems that can produce tornadoes, these little violent columns of air that move across the landscape. Right now, however, the overarching weather environment is again favorable for more tornadoes in the hard-hit beleaguered states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, parts of Nebraska, down towards Missouri once again. We already saw a deadly tornado in northeast Oklahoma with winds almost 300 kilometers per hour barely 72 hours ago, and Oklahoma is once again at risk today. We tend to see a lot of these storms in the spring months, April, May, and especially into June, as the buildup of summer warmth meets cold air left in the upper atmosphere. That brews thunderstorms. But that's just one part of the equation. We also need a change of wind speed and direction with height called wind shear to get these storms to spin. And today, all those ingredients look to overlap to cause more tornadoes.
So, Matthew, I know you're saying that it's not totally abnormal and this is the period in which we would normally see them, but are we seeing more than what we normally would?
Most definitely. I think this month, in April, we saw over 300 of them. That is more than average. In fact, it's the second most on record, falling only behind the gangbuster season of April 2011. So we've seen a lot more tornadoes. Part of it is that we're noticing more, but part of it is really that it was just a very active month. We had repeated insurgences of cold air kicking up warmth and moisture to brew storms. The jet stream pattern, the upper level winds were very favorable. And part of it, too, in addition to tornadoes, we saw widespread hurricane force winds hail to about baseball, softball size. In fact, when I chase these storms, I'm used to breaking windshields, breaking the windows in my car. I even have special safety glasses and a special helmet that we use. Of course, we stream it all live in the My Radar app and try to get people aware of what's going on and give them advanced warning. The National Weather Service issues warnings as well. But really, with weather like this, people have to stay on their toes.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, and it's extremely dangerous as well. I was just talking to our, weather reporter, and she was saying we're not quite exactly sure whether tornadoes, for example, are a result of climate change. But can you shed any more light on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a very nuanced approach we have to take because we know that the environment is getting warmer and more moist. Warm air holds more water. In fact, every degree Celsius the air temperature increases, the air can hold about 7% more water. So we have more juice for these storms to get going. But the issue is, even if we get more storms, that doesn't guarantee more tornadoes because the upper level winds in the atmosphere are actually weakening a little bit thanks to climate change. So we get more thunderstorms, a little bit less energy for spin. We're not sure what the net product is yet. What we think may be happening is that the window, the season for tornadoes is expanding. So tornado season's getting longer, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting more tornadoes at any given point.
Matthew, will you stay safe out there? Thanks so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you.
Now to the rest of the day's news. And yesterday we focused on the threat from Russia and China. And we heard that term, a malign state. Well, just 24 hours after Vladimir Putin was sworn in for a fifth term, the government here announced it was expelling Russia's defence attaché from the UK. That's after an increase in malign activity by Russia in the UK and Europe. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, can explain more.
It has been a country retreat for Russian diplomats in Sussex for 80 years, but also recently a base for Russian spying, says the British government. It is closing down Seacock's house and several other properties in what is one of the biggest anti-Russian espionage sweeps in years. Most significant is the expulsion of this man, Colonel Maxim Elovic, the first Russian defence attaché ever to be thrown out of Britain. Announcing the measures, Home Secretary James Cleverly anticipated a furious reaction from Russia.
In the coming days, we should expect accusations of Russophobia, conspiracy theories and hysteria from the Russian government. This is not new, and the British people and the British government will not fall for it and will not be taken for fools by Putin's bots, trolls and lackeys.
In Moscow, the Russian Foreign Ministry angrily accused Britain of using outright lies to justify anti-Russian measures. Its spokeswoman Maria Zakharova warned Russia would take appropriate measures in response. The British government believes Colonel Elevik is a secret operative with the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, thought to be behind a pattern of malign activity across Europe and allegedly hiring British nationals to carry out arson attacks on Ukrainian-linked businesses in the UK. How unprecedented is what has just happened? We spoke to one former British defence attaché in Moscow who says those attacks crossed a line.
The straw which broke the camel's back is the allegations that the GRU were maybe behind recent arson attacks. That's the final straw, and actually, ultimately, the security argument to expel the defence attaché has outweighed the advantages of maintaining military-to-military ties.
It is 6 years since 23 Russian diplomats were expelled from Britain in the wake of the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, also the work of the GRU. But throwing out an official of Colonel Elevik's rank and status is unprecedented. The British government will have thought long and hard before taking this drastic step because it doesn't come without a potential cost. In their day jobs, defence attachés play a key role as military liaison with the host country. Crucially, that can help prevent misunderstandings leading to dangerous escalation. And losing that important line of communication is not ideal in a time of war. It is highly likely Russia responds in kind against British diplomats in Moscow. But its activity here and abroad requires punishment, says the UK, whatever the consequences. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Well, Dom mentioned sanctions there. Well, let's talk about sanctions. They're meant to be the West's way of punishing Russia for its war in Ukraine. But Sky News has found that Russia made more money from its oil and gas industry in the past 3 months than any comparable period since the early days of the Ukrainian invasion. So how is that even possible? I sat down with our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, to find out more. Ed, this is part of a wider, brilliant investigation that you've been following for several months on how Russia has managed to evade the sanctions that the West has imposed. Tell us about this latest one that you've been following.
Yeah, that's right, Yalda, because there's kind of like all these different dimensions. There's a question of, how is it that Russia is able to get so many missiles, but what are they using to pay with it? So, where are they making their money? And this is a big part of that. Russia makes a lot of money from oil products. And if you look at the kind of revenues they're making, well, let me show you. Let me just show you, first of all, Russian tax revenues from oil and gas, OK? So we're just looking at the revenues that are kind of coming into the Kremlin. You can see they were relatively high just in the early days after the invasion. That was around there, so that's February 22. But just look more recently. I'll add this line showing you the 3-month average. Look at that red line. It's kind of now... That's more or less at the highest level that we've seen since May 2022. So the money is flowing in, is the main point from this.
So where is it going? And I understand it's also managed to make its way back into this country.
Yeah, I mean, like, the interesting thing here, aside from anything else, is we're getting this lesson. Never have we imposed as many sanctions as this. And it is having an impact on the nature of globalization, leaving aside the kind of questions of what it's doing for the war in Ukraine. Previously, this was how the geography of Russian oil exports looked. So the biggest importers of Russian oil, the EU, the US and China. But now, obviously, these countries, the US and the EU and the UK, have said we're not taking Russian oil. OK, so that sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? And as a result, this map has kind of crept eastwards. And now it's China, it's India, a lot to India, and Turkey as well. So it's a completely different geography. But here's the catch. Like, although we are not taking oil directly from Russia, we might well be taking it indirectly. And that's because when the oil leaves Russia, it goes to, say, India, it goes into the refineries, and at that point, it's kind of laundered, an oil product. So they're turning it into kerosene, they're turning it into diesel, into gasoline. Those products can then be shipped to Europe, to the UK, to the US, and they're not covered by sanctions. And actually, here's the thing, we know that's happening because this is showing you oil imports to the UK from India. And before the invasion of Ukraine, it was relatively low. It was quite a small part of our kind of oil market. And this is things like jet fuel, you've got naphtha, you've got diesel. Now look after the invasion. Look at these bars and look at how much higher they are than before the invasion. So almost in real time, we are seeing the market shifting. Globalization is kind of doing what it's doing. And within those bars, You don't know for sure because a lot of this oil just goes from Russia into India, it goes into the refineries. You don't know for sure which molecules came originally from Russia, but we're pretty certain that quite a few of the molecules you're using to fill your diesel car, or indeed if you're flying from the UK, that they began their life in Russia.
Talk us through the bigger picture then, Ed, because I think what has blown my mind is these graphs and stats that we see in terms of the growth in Russia's economy.
I mean, that's the kind of slightly worrying thing as far as many Western economies are concerned. This is just showing you the growth rates for G7 economies, so there's the UK down there, not very good. This is the projected growth rate for this year that we're in at the moment for the International Monetary Fund. And you can see that Russia, that red bar over there, well, it is projected to grow faster than anywhere in the G7 this year. So if you were looking for a pretty clear indication of why the Russian economy is doing pretty, you know, it's doing okay, certainly, it's in that chart. And it's worth just saying, you know, there were question marks over whether this is the kind of growth that we see here. You know, that a lot of that is kind of military spending rather than spending in the consumer economy. But even so, if that's your mark of success in this, and remember at the start of the invasion, at the start of imposing these sanctions, the point was to wage economic war on Russia. Well, it might not be going quite as well as people had been expecting.
That's our Ed Conway, and as I said, Ed has been following this investigation for some time, and this is the third part of his series. You can learn much more on our website about Ed's investigation and his work. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, the impact of war on Gaza's children. I'll be joined in the studio by two doctors who have worked in hospitals in the Gaza Strip during Israel's offensive, to hear about the huge toll the fighting is having on people from newborns to the elderly. Plus, it's saved millions of lives, but it's been plagued by controversy. Find out why AstraZeneca is withdrawing its COVID-19 vaccine.
So Charlie's allergic to milk, egg and bananas, so he's got 3 food allergies, but the trial is focusing on the milk. And we discovered he had a milk allergy at about 6 months when he was weaning. And he had a little taste of an ice cream and his sort of face just, blew up. It was just very swollen lips and eyes. So that's when we first identified the allergy. Since then, it was strict avoidance, really.
Its aim is to make things safer for Charlie. I think it's been well recognised it's not a cure, but what it will do, hopefully, is desensitise the body to the allergen, his milk allergen, which means he will be able to take a maintenance daily dose, which would then hopefully prevent him from having any reactions to trace or cross-contamination. Having the milk allergy takes over your life, it's at the forefront of everything that we do. So, like you say, we check and double-check the whole time. And we will carry on to doing that with, even on this trial. You're very restricted. You can't be spontaneous. You have to plan and be organised. So it really does take over your life, and everything revolves around Charlie and his food, really. The trial's been an absolutely amazing experience so far. It's life-changing. So basically, when Charlie started, he needed a challenge to see what his threshold for reaction was. And that was very difficult for us because it meant he had to be exposed in a controlled environment to a reaction. So at that point in time, he was actually showing signs of reaction at 0.5 mil. And then at 3 mils was a reaction, and a serious reaction. He's now drinking 30 mils of milk as part of this trial, and he will soon be up to 45 mils of milk, which is something we could never have imagined. It's showing real promise, and hopefully that gives some hope, because without this trial, there isn't really any hope. It's just strict avoidance and keeping the risk low, whereas this can, for Charlie, if it works, and for many others, then it might make his future a bit safer.
Welcome back to the programme. We've got some breaking news that's just come in to us. Police say they've arrested 3 men in Bolton and Wigan on suspicion of, quote, commission, preparation and instigation of acts of terrorism. Now, the Greater Manchester Police say the men, aged 35, 36 and 51, were arrested at separate locations and have been taken into custody for questioning. A statement has also been released from Assistant Chief Constable Rob Potts, who holds responsibility for counter-terrorism policing in the northwest of England. And that statement says that today's activities have been the culmination of much detailed planning, and we have put measures in place to minimise disruption to local residents as much as possible. The statement continues to say, I understand that any time arrests of this nature are made, it will cause concerns and people will naturally have questions, although we can't go into specific details of the investigation at this stage. I want to reassure members of the public that we do not currently believe there to be any wider threat linked to today's activity. Further detail will be released where appropriate as the investigation progresses. So that's a statement from the Assistant Chief Constable Rob Potts, who, as I said, holds responsibility for counter-terrorism policing in the northwest, about those 3 arrests, the 3 men arrested in the north of England on suspicion of commission, preparation and instigation of acts of terrorism. We are following that story closely, and we will be bringing you more information as we get it. Now, it's thought to have saved millions of lives, but AstraZeneca hasn't had an easy ride. Last week, we covered the allegations brought against the medical firm by a father who blames his brain injury on the COVID-19 vaccine. Billions of doses were made, distributed worldwide during the height of the pandemic. Now the jab developed by scientists in the UK is being taken off the market. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore explains why.
In the dark days of lockdown, AstraZeneca's COVID jab was quite literally the shot in the arm we needed. Billions of doses later, its time is up. The vaccine withdrawn by the company because of falling demand. Augusta Turiaco's family won't miss it. She died 19 days after having the jab in Italy, and they're taking legal action against the pharmaceutical giant.
My family and I are not against vaccinations. We want to clarify this. When my sister died, we invited people to get vaccinated, as long as it was a safe vaccine. And for us, AstraZeneca, unfortunately, was not a safe vaccine.
Brian Pinker was the first to have the Vacavria vaccine in January 2021. Boris Johnson also had the jab, heaping praise on the Oxford University scientists who developed it. In its first year, 3 billion doses were distributed, with more than 6 million lives saved. But the United States never licensed the vaccine, and as clotting concerns grew, it was suspended or withdrawn, first in Denmark and then several other European countries, while in the UK it was restricted, first only to be used in people over 30, then those over 40.
And its legacy should be definitely a positive one rather than a negative one. So across the height of the pandemic, the AstraZeneca vaccine was indeed the vaccine for the world. It was a vaccine that was much cheaper to manufacture. It could be stored at fridge-like temperatures rather than the ultra-cold chain, the ultra-frozen temperatures that were needed by Pfizer and Moderna. So it was much easier to transport to, for example, rural settings in Africa and be deployed there.
AstraZeneca has always insisted the vaccine's benefits outweigh the risks. A spokesperson added, "We are incredibly proud of the role Vacavria played in ending the global pandemic. Multiple variant COVID-19 vaccines have since been developed. This has led to a decline in demand for Vacavria, which is no longer being manufactured or supplied." But the biotech that underpins the vaccine may survive, perhaps tweaked to avoid blood clots, ready for the next race against a virus. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
Stay with us. Coming up, we'll be focusing on the 600,000 children in Rafah who have nowhere safe to go. We'll have the latest from Gaza and speak to some of those who witnessed for themselves the impact war is having on the most vulnerable there. Welcome back. Let's focus on the situation in the Middle East. Today, the US State Department confirmed the government had paused a shipment of bombs and munitions and is reviewing others because of fears the weapons would be used to bombard Rafah. The supply of aid has also been restricted. Well, Israel says the Kerem Shalom crossing in the south is open for trucks from Egypt, but the UN disputes this. And the Rafah crossing, where most of the aid had been entering, is now closed and under IDF control. Their armoured vehicles shown here in this video. Well, a video geolocated by Sky News shows an IDF tank firing near the area this morning. And at the Erez crossing in the north, there are also disputed reports about if aid is entering. Well, coming up, we'll focus on the plight of the most vulnerable in Gaza. But first, this report from our international correspondent, John Sparks.
The city of Rafah. It used to symbolize something of a refuge, but nobody believes that anymore. In the center, our team finds the unmistakable signs of a missile strike. The smoke and distress and the horror. This is the second day of operations by the Israeli Defense Force in southern Gaza, a campaign they've described as limited. But this looks like all-out war. In Washington, Israel's closest ally went public with its displeasure.
So we've been very clear, Senator, as you know, from the very beginning that that Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions.
It seems the Israelis aren't listening. They've warned people to evacuate from the eastern side of Rafah, and hundreds of thousands have taken to the road, including May and her children, here perched on a cart. She's been displaced 4 times since the fighting in Gaza began.
As you can see, here we are. We don't know what lies around the corner. There's no safe place in Gaza. Even here. God help us.
Anything of value has been packed into their cart, now heading to a place called Al-Mawasi. It's been designated by Israel as a humanitarian area, but the aid agencies have called it a nightmare. Now we've got a situation where you've got hundreds of thousands of people on the move again to a so-called humanitarian area. Are you prepared for that?
No one is prepared to deal with the forced displacement of 1.4 million people. It's not possible. It's actually just not possible. I don't even think if all the supplies we needed and wanted were in the Gaza Strip, it would be possible to help.
That's been disputed by the Israeli government. Officials say they've facilitated a surplus of aid and reopened this crossing called Kerem Shalom after a Hamas attack. But the UN says the assistance hasn't reached them.
No aid has been received in the Gaza Strip. No aid and no fuel. So this is the 3rd day now that we have received no humanitarian supplies.
Another strike is met with a collective cry of terror. The aftermath then blots out the sun. Israel's leaders say they're eliminating Hamas and its terrorist infrastructure as they seek total victory. But their critics accuse them of a catastrophe. John Sparks, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Well, as we've been reporting here on the programme over the last couple of days, UNICEF says there is nowhere safe for some 600,000 children who are stuck in Rafah. The children's charity says over 850,000 kids across the Gaza Strip are now internally displaced and that thousands have been injured or killed. Well, joining me now in the studio are two doctors who have seen for themselves the impact the war is having on children, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta and Dr. Victoria Rose. Thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Dr. Rose, you've just recently returned from Gaza and we have some of your footage from there. I'm just going to play that for our viewers.
You have to save everything. So this is the towel that my gown was in, which I'm going to save because we'll probably use that as some sort of undersheets because we don't have a lot of drapes. We're often using the gown to drape.
Victoria, that's your image there. You know, Dr. Abu Sitta, we know the work that you have also done in Gaza, but just give us a sense of the situation on the ground. We've heard extensively from Dr. Abu Sitta on it, but just what did you see?
It was a huge amount of work to be done, particularly by plastic surgery. It's all shrapnel wounds, blast wounds, burns. The majority of the people that I treated were children. You can see from the footage that the children are, you know, everybody is displaced, there's no homes, so the children are basically running around in the streets outside the hospital. So they get hit by shrapnel after the bombs explode. We had a huge number of kids with sort of amputations, hands, legs, lots of long bone fractures, lots of burns. It was just non-stop, really.
And of course, we continue to report on the fact that hospitals remain overwhelmed, those hospitals that remain standing. We've actually got some material of some children, I believe 8 children, that are going to be evacuated to Italy, who have severe burns. And this is just 8. There are thousands who have been impacted.
From the very beginning, from October, we were seeing that half of the wounded coming through the operating rooms were children. And that has continued. And so now, of the 75,000 wounded, half are children. And these kids, a lot of them have very severe injuries, will need complex surgeries. And what we know, unfortunately, in the long term, from all of the medical literature, is that children with war injuries will need between 8 and 12 surgeries by the time they reach adult age. And so this is a lifetime of surgery awaiting these kids, not just now.
Dr. Rose, what is the responsibility then of governments like here in the UK? Because there are calls to try and evacuate some of these children.
I can understand why the preference has been to evacuate the children to the local countries, because obviously it's difficult. It's a foreign language in the UK that it's going to be difficult for them to communicate. Anyone under 16 has got to come with a relative. So it is a big ask, but I think having recently been to Qatar as well to try and sort out some evacuations, it's very clear that the local countries are flooded. So Qatar now is in a situation where it has 1,000 Gazan patients blocking beds. I mean that in a, you know, not in a derogatory way, but they have nowhere to discharge these patients to once they've treated.
And so there's no clarity about whether they can stay in Qatar. Where do they go?
Well, they can't really stay in Qatar because they need to be moved out so that they can take more, and this is the problem. So Qatar have recently stopped their program of accepting until they can come to some sort of arrangement with Egypt to transfer patients back. So this is going to happen to all the neighbouring countries. I think we need to step in some sort of way, particularly now that places like, as you've shown, Italy and Switzerland and France have taken patients. We are very well placed in the UK to manage these wounds. I mean, we have a huge number of expertise, particularly in orthopaedics and reconstructive surgery. This wouldn't be difficult for the medical teams to cope with. And I think now, even if we took, you know, a few, it would ease the load.
Dr. Abu Sitta, you have just returned this evening from a vigil of a friend of yours, Dr. Adnan AlBR, who was declared dead by the Israeli prison authorities after he was believed to have been taken from Al-Shifa hospital. Just tell us a little bit more about this doctor.
So the reason the vigil was outside King's College Hospital is that he had been trained there. He was the head of orthopedic surgery at Shifa Hospital. And as an ultimate act of dedication to his patients, he remained at Shifa Hospital, even when it was besieged by the Israeli army. When the WHO arranged for the evacuation, he then moved to another hospital in the north, which was then bombed by the Israelis, and he moved to a third hospital where the Israelis arrested him. And that was towards the end of last year. And unfortunately, a few days ago, his family was informed that he had died in prison, and that some of the ex-prisoners had seen evidence of trauma to his face and to his head, indicating that he had been beaten by his prison guards.
You yourself have faced your own level of controversy in the last couple of months. You were banned from entering Germany, banned from entering France last weekend because of accusations that the Israelis have made towards you. They've accused you of being sympathetic to militant groups. Just your response to that.
So the ban to France is actually as a result of a ban that the German authorities had placed on me for all Schengen countries. It's a reflection of the fact that these governments are trying to silence the voices that are calling for a ceasefire. It's an example of how the German government is failing to grasp the idea that it is their duty as the second largest exporter of weapons to Israel to allow the public opinion in Germany to hear the witness statements. And so rather than try to silence the witnesses, rather than hear the witnesses, they're trying to silence the witnesses. And not only have they banned me from going into Germany, they've managed to kind of put a ban for me to enter any of the Schengen area countries. And despite the fact that, my witness evidence was part of the statement of South Africa in the International Court of Justice.
And in the meantime, the situation in Gaza, Dr. Abu Sitta has talked about his situation and that of doctors like Adnan AlBR. The hospitals there, the medical staff remain on the front lines of this.
They do, and they're absolutely depleted as well. A lot of the medics that haven't been sort of abducted and killed have sort of been threatened and have left the hospitals. There are staff from Al-Shifa who have come down to the European Gaza hospital, which is the only functioning hospital now in the Gaza Strip. But they've come down and these doctors aren't paid because they're not doctors from the European Gaza hospital. So they're working for free. And even the doctors in the European Gaza hospital aren't paid. They're given a salary once every sort of couple of months, and it's half their salary. So a lot of these doctors are not working. They have decided to look after their relatives who have been injured, or they are the sole carer for their children when the rest of their family has been killed. So there's really, no body of doctors on the ground now. I was assisted mainly by medical students when I was operating.
And we continue to talk about these children who, some of them, if you can give us a sense, UNICEF has said 600,000 remain at risk and shouldn't be evacuated or moved. But from your assessment, what is the number of children that are severely at risk and need to be moved urgently?
So we need to know that 60% of Gaza's population was under the age of 16 when the war started. And therefore, whatever number that there is in any area, 60% of these were children. These children, we understand from UNICEF, are malnourished by 7 months of a manufactured famine. And so they're even at the higher risk of the infectious diseases that are rife because of the breakdown in public health. If they're injured, they're less likely to heal because their malnourished bodies are incapable of healing in this stage. And they have been they had moved with their families to Rafah because they were told at the beginning of the war, this is the safe zone, and live in tents, so completely exposed. And if they move again, they will be moving without these tents, so even more exposed, living out in the open, in areas that are overwhelmed by the number of internally displaced.
Okay, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sita and Dr. Victoria Rose, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Well, as we were saying, the situation for anyone in Gaza in need of medical treatment is dangerous. Last week, our US correspondent Mark Stone brought us the story of a family in Washington, D.C., attempting to get another family inside Gaza out to safety. The four parents are united by a rare illness which affects their daughters, Julia and Annabelle. Just have a listen.
Our living condition during the wartime is very difficult. The journey to get her a medicine is full of difficulties. But for me, it's important to get her the medicine rather than to have food for any one of us.
We've been trying to gather a group that can support her. It's been constant communication and really difficult with the translation issues.
From the moment that we first heard, it was really a frenetic kind of, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? You know, we take such care to protect Annabelle from any possible stimulus that might be hard on her. She is vulnerable, and she's in the most protective, comfortable, safe home that, you know, any child could hope for. And Julia's circumstances are just perilous.
Well, let's go straight to Mark. And Mark, in all of this devastation, I mean, watching your story there, and I urge our viewers to go on our website and look at it. It's about 5.5 minutes, but really a story about kindness and humanity as well in all the heartbreak. And you've got a bit of an update on Julia's story.
Yes, I think it's the individual stories which I think bring the enormity and the humanity at the heart of all of this. Well, I'm afraid to say that Julia is still there because the border, the Rafah border that links Gaza with Egypt, that's the only border through which she and her family could cross, is closed at the moment, closed a couple of days ago, as we know. So although we think that she is on a list to be evacuated to the UAE, to the United Arab Emirates, she isn't going anywhere at the moment. We did get this latest video from her father that he sent through today. Have a little look at this. This, I'm told by her father, was a moment where she was in the tent. She could hear the singing of the children outside. With AHC, this disease that she's got, noise can either be positive or negative. Music is something that she reacts clearly very well to. But she could have a seizure, perhaps a fatal seizure, at any point from frightening noises, and there are so many of them in Rafah at the moment. So it's really very desperate. It's also fascinating to understand the way that people are able to be evacuated. There are these lists I talk about to get people out. They have to make a judgment about how seriously ill someone is. If they're too ill, there is frankly no point in evacuating them. And the Israeli authorities, the Egyptians and the Palestinian authorities, they all have to check these lists to determine who stays and who gets to leave.
Mark, a heartbreaking story there. Thank you so much for bringing us up to date there on Julia's situation. Now, hundreds of millions of people tune in across the world each year to watch the Eurovision Song Contest. It bills itself as a non-political event, but this year's competition taking place in Sweden is, like much of the rest of the world, caught up in the tensions surrounding the war in Gaza. Last night, a former entry for Sweden, Eric Saad, wore a keffiyeh, a traditional scarf seen as a symbol of support for the Palestinian people. Just have a look.
Stop, don't say that it's impossible, 'cause I know it's possible. Go on, no, you...
Well, let's cross live now to Malmo in Sweden and speak to our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins. And Siobhan, I mean, the Eurovision Song Contest organisers have put out a statement about this this performance and also the use of the keffiyeh, saying, well, tell us exactly what they've said, actually.
Well, as you say, they put out a statement saying that they regret that this former contestant had politicised an event which they say is apolitical. I'm actually standing outside the Malmo arena now, and the final dress rehearsal for the second semi-final is just wrapping up. And it's, of course, in that semi-final tomorrow night that we'll see Adnan AlBR, the Israeli entry, fight for her position in the final amongst what has been months of controversy. We know that initially Israel was asked to change the lyrics of their song because they were told they were too political, that they referred to the October 7th attacks. The song has been rewritten, it's been renamed, and she's performing again, but not despite a lot of opposition. There have been months of protests in the city. And tomorrow, tens of thousands more will go onto the streets to call for her to be removed. And we've been speaking to people outside this arena, and many of them have been saying actually they don't think that this contest should be politicised. But then on the other side, others have been saying, well, actually, it is a very difficult situation for people around the world, and of course it's natural for people to react to what's happening in Gaza. Now, despite all of this, the organisers of this competition have said this is not a political event, but they don't seem to be able to stop politics from seeping in, and certainly the police here will be on high alert. We've seen numbers gathered on the corners, up on the roofs. There is nothing they can do to stop two wars from seeping into what is happening in this city.
Yeah, I mean, Siobhan, as you say, a couple of years ago, we heard about the situation, of course, with the Russians and the Belarusians being banned from the competition. And now we're seeing a very similar call for the Israeli contestant. Siobhan, thank you so much. Well, that brings an end to our programme this evening. We'll be back again tomorrow night. Good night.